So, as you probably guessed, I haven't been uploading in a little while. Aside from work popping up and, of course, the Christmas and New Year's season, I spent a lot of time playing Final Fantasy 15 last year when it came out for Windows, and I was super excited to play it when it was released. In fact, it's one of the fewer games that I wanted to complete every single achievement for, and now I sit amongst the ranks of the elite gamers.
And I met with the president of the Virgin Islands.
NANI?!
Big flexes aside, I feel that now I can review this game confidently, having experienced everything that the game had to offer, including all of the DLC content, and give you guys my fair evaluation of the game that will remain spoiler-free, in case there are some of you who still haven't had the chance to play it. So, Final Fantasy 15 was released solely for consoles back in September 2016, and last year in 2018, it released for Windows versions by none other than Square Enix, who have been the developers of the franchise since 1987. This game was actually in development from 2006 under the original title Final Fantasy Versus 13, which was supposed to have been another chapter within the Fabula Nova Crystallis series, but there were many road bumps along the way. With the changing of hands in the project and the creation of a new game engine, the games released kept getting pushed further away. But, in turn, the game began to evolve into something far more elaborate than what had been conceived. Since its release, however, the game has received much praise for its beautiful art direction and how fluid the game is as a whole. But that goes without saying that there were various criticisms in the storyline being disjointed and some issues with the combat system. Hopefully, I'll be able to address these as we go along in this review play. The big news that was dropped recently was the promise of 4 new DLCs last year, which was sadly dropped due to the departure of the project director in November. The question now is whether or not new content will be added to expand 15's universe any further. So, without going on any further tangents, let's just jump straight into it. The first thing I'll address is the story element of the game, and my reasoning for this is because this seems to be the most critiqued part of the whole project. To be honest, without having watched all of the previous media that was released with the game, such as the full-length movie Kingsglaive and the animated net series Brotherhood, you can easily miss a lot of the contextual links within the game. My criticisms within the game itself is the fact that in amongst the plot, you will have your companions suddenly announce that they have to leave the party for a little while without further elaborating on why, and then suddenly return without mentioning what happened when they came back. To me, I think this was an intentional move by Square Enix to open up potential DLC routes for people to explore later on to fill these gaps, which seems to be a tactic that game companies use to get people engaging with more of their products. Now, as I've created this review, I half debated with myself as to whether or not to include my analysis of the lore as part of my video, but when I realised it would stretch the time out to 30 minutes, I knew that probably 2/3 of you would get bored as hell and resort to watching TikTok videos, so I'll include a sneaky link to that lore video to watch at your own perusal. It sounds really wanky for me to try and get you to watch that video, but the reason is because I've combed through all the movies, the trailers, and the DLCs to get a full understanding of how multiple things are tied in and why there's such a deeper plot aside from bad nation goes to war with supposedly good nation, evil has upper hand of good until the chosen one can fulfill prophecy. So if you're willing to get a crash course of my take on the universe, then check that video out. When all the pieces are put together and you've got the full context as to what the heck is going on, I thought the story was pretty strong. Although, there was still probably a lot of things that Square Enix probably wanted to include in the game, but decided the game shouldn't be bigger than Ben-Hur. Aside from the main plotline, the backstories intertwined with the characters themselves really stole the show, as this played a huge role in the way they interacted with each other. Not only does it provide personalities to most people you encounter, but as you're travelling along with the affectionately named Chocobros, to me it sort of brought down the barrier between player and character, and you're almost fooled into a sense of belonging within the group. I think this was the main clincher for me, as it's almost too common for people to be playing semi-lifeless characters. 15's gameplay and combat has sort of moved away from the older style of gameplay that was synonymous with that typical JRPG system that we played on previous Final Fantasy titles, making the combat more real-time rather than engaging in a random fight sequence in the middle of an empty field. Granted, they did include a wait system within the combat tree that you could engage if the battles were too intense for some people, which I think it was to make it semi-accommodating for the first timers, but even then, I felt this destroyed a lot of the pacing in the game, making combat more of a thinking time rather than a button smasher. This, however, highlights a bit of the critique here, as people consider the nature of a button smasher combat easy. Yes, there is a tactical method to which you can line up the varieties of weapons you have at your disposal to expose a specific weakness of an opponent, but generally you find your favourite weapons and combat style and can stick with that most of the time without having to be too technical. I think the main thing that gave combat a bit more pizzazz was introducing warping to the mix. This added a layer of dimensionality to how you engaged with large enemies, flying enemies, and closing the distance between you and an opponent quickly. Without this, combat could have easily become more generic and disengaging. My main gripe with the combat was the auto-lock system, where you would want to prioritise attacking an enemy by looking at it with the game camera, but for some reason your character would decide that the enemy behind the cluster of 6 other enemies is the one you want to attack first. Sure, you could cycle through your opponents using hotkeys, but in the midst of combat, you're not going to slow down and select your target if you're being rushed by multiple enemies. Aside from combat, the exploration side of the gameplay was vast enough to make walking painful, which is why the party was gifted with the use of the regalia, the royal car. The open world nature of the first 9 chapters made majority of your travels on land in the car, and I know that some didn't like the restrictiveness of the regalia even in the manual driving mode. In a sense, this captured some of the realism for me, because rather than bulldozing your way to every location in the game, there was a sensibility in the way you treated the car, as if the characters had an unspoken respect for Noctis's dad's car. This does change when you get the Type D mod of the regalia to live out your off-road dreams, but it still pulled you into line when you jumped or drove into a place that you shouldn't be allowed to go. If the car didn't yank your frank, you had the option to ride by chocobo, which actually was a really nice touch to travelling on foot. Once you had completed the quest to be able to hire them, it made journeying to the places that you couldn't get to with the car more quicker. I did, however, find the controls a bit clunky, and sometimes turning a chocobo to run in the direction you wanted to go had a turning circle like a double trailer truck. Even if your camera was facing the direction you wanted to go, the chocobo would sort of curve around before you managed to find the right key press to get it to run in the direction you wanted it to go. When you sort of get used to the handling of it, traversing through the lands became quite a breeze, and after a while you can't help but sing along with Prompto when the same motif for the chocobos play as you ride your avian companion, as it has done for many Final Fantasy games. If chocobos still weren't tickling the old pickle, you could eventually fly in the regalia once the main game had finished, and there's also an option to sail by boat, which is a pivotal thing when heading to Altissia for the first time. Questing in 15 gets a 6 out of 10 from me. I know in particular the side quests received many criticisms, and I must admit they did get a little tedious over time, being somewhat repetitive in nature. You would interact with various NPCs who would either send you to retrieve an item or to hunt down a creature, or you could take up bounties to go on hunts and earn gil to build your reputation as a hunter to take on bigger and badder boss creatures. On Steam, this was a definite requirement to getting one of the bigger achievements, having you complete a total of 80 side quests. But on your first playthrough of the game, it's pretty tolerable. And despite the quest being of the same concept, the environment or the creature you would face would be different, which again is okay for a first playthrough, but going through it all again for New Game Plus was a little bit tiring. Having said that, New Game Plus does remember some of the items that you have picked up, so you don't have to fetch the same item again in a side quest, which was a bit of a relief. The main quest in regards to the story made more sense on the second playthrough, but if I had as much knowledge of the story as I did when I played it through later, things definitely would have made a lot more sense in regards to why characters would respond the way they do. Now, here's a big old warning for you. I'm going to be talking about the proverbial second half of the game, so if you want to go in blind, I suggest you obnoxiously yell over the top of this video so you don't have to hear what I'm going to explain. I think I can make a clickable thing to skip ahead, so if it hasn't come up, well, I'm just incompetent. So after the events in Altissia, the story really changed gears, and there was this overwhelming sense of dread and sadness, which I think they really wanted to capture. The full weight of the Star Scourge was slowly encumbering the world, and the dynamics between the characters had changed a lot, especially now they're essentially a man down until the last chapter. On a gameplay side of things, you lost the open world entirely, and for a few chapters were bound to travelling by train, and your agenda was purely focused on getting the job done. In a way, despite this becoming somewhat linear with the story, and the atmosphere of the game really changed from the fun-loving adventure with 4 friends to a melancholy, angsty vibe and having the party split up at times, I think this was a really clever move with developing the whole plot. In a sense, there was the element that Noctis could ignore his responsibilities to be the king in the earlier chapters, going on adventures and exploring and so on. But then the reality of his situation kicks in, where it was time he had to face up to his fate and roll with whatever had to come to pass. The sacrifices that people made along the way to ensure that Noctis could fulfill his destiny by defeating the Star Scourge was the overall happy ending for the world, but not the ending the player wants when they spent 60 hours adventuring with characters they've become attached to. Episode Ignis did cover this a little bit, however, making a more happier ending, which I reckon most people would have felt very satisfied with. But the canonical ending fits in with how everything lines up with the story and its lore, which I really have to commend the writers on. Aside from the primary elements of the game, however, the things that you could do on the side were some of the main highlights of what 15 had to offer. Along the way, Prompto would be snapping pictures of your journey, whether it would be in combat, in camp, or just adventuring across the lands. And there were copious amounts of mini-games and challenges that you could participate in, one of these in particular being Noctis' specialised skill, which was fishing. I have to say though, there was something unique and interesting with the way the fishing mechanic was handled in the game. When you landed some of the bigger catches, there actually was a sense of struggle when reeling the fish in, juggling between the tension and durability of the line and fighting against the direction the fish was going. It got frustrating at times, especially when you actually lost what was on the end of the line. But at the same time, actually catching the fish felt like a sense of achievement rather than a quick spam of reeling it in and boom, you've caught the biggest fish in the world. Overall, while most had their qualms with the story as a whole, upon my own reflection, the rewatching of all the media, the trailers, reading the texts, and playing the game twice through, I can see how everything ties in together. And whilst it is a convoluted approach to understanding the entire game as a whole, the integration of it all and the thought put into this is really clever. It's so good that this hasn't affected too much of the gameplay after being in development for so long. It's a shame that the second half was a little bit weaker than the first. But it still makes for a solid presentation of a game and universe that had me invested for most, if not all the way through. My thoughts on the DLC are a little bit mixed. I thought that episodes Ignis and Gladiolus was pretty good as it brought a different playstyle to the game, but I found episode Promptos a little bit slower. Each DLC's contribution to the main story filled the gaps that were left when different events in the game happened, again, no spoilers, and it was a nice change from solely playing as Noctis. My main criticisms lie with episode Prompto, because there were some elements like the snowmobile riding that felt like it was a racing mechanic that was forced into the game. I found it more frustrating than anything, because the moment you would get hit by a missile on this particular quest, the timing in between the next missile hit and you getting on the snowmobile would interrupt you from taking off again. So I ended up running the course on foot rather than using the snowmobile as intended. Not only that, but the episode itself felt like it was trying to stretch out your playtime by upgrading the snowmobile and fight bosses rather than actually progress through the story set before you. Probably the only nice touch was the fact that you were accompanied by Aranea in the episode. With each of the DLCs, you received new outfits or weapons to be used in the main game, which was okay, but I was more happy at the fact that they were somewhat balanced, rather than paying for a DLC to have the penultimate weapon that makes combat even more easier. Comrades, on the other hand, was pretty fun, but unfortunately there was no online community whatsoever. Whether or not this was Square Enix's attempt to begin an MMORPG within this particular universe, you were still able to play comrades with AI characters and progress through the story, which, again, filled a gap in the period of time in between major story events. Prior to this game, I spent many hours playing the remastered version of Final Fantasy X and X2, which had a beautiful nostalgic feeling to the game despite their overhaul to many of the game's assets, including characters and the UI. So my mindset going into Final Fantasy 15 was an expectation of a semi-fantasy world with a few abstract landscapes and other various nuances I've been used to with other Final Fantasy titles. However, upon opening the game, the first time into the arid landscape of the lead region threw me off my expectations. The game had been promoted with a theme, a fantasy based on reality, and this was evident in the design of their landscape, taking place in a more real-world modern setting. Locations such as Golden Key were modelled off locations in the Bahamas, and Altissia being reminiscent of Venice, reflected by their gondolas and the general architecture. But each of these places also had a unique spin added to it by the artists, which still kept true to its modelled origins, but at the same time kept it looking fresh and original. Aside from the locations, what hooked me into the game though was the immaculate presentation of food when you first make camp during a quest. I had cooked the toasty rice balls, and the detail from the textures of the rice made my eyes open up wider than it had ever gone in my life. The game is presented immaculately, and since its first conception as Final Fantasy Versus 13, you can definitely see the evolution of its concept to the final product. The style and the graphics had really changed as the project progressed, giving us this beautifully artistic product for us at release. The sound for this game was alright, but far from perfect. For what it was worth, it did the job that it was supposed to, but it didn't blow me away in the immersion meter. There were some things in the game, just really subtle things that you don't really notice is missing until it's not there. For instance, something as simple as a clap, or when a character pats each other on the back, small Foley elements like that were missing. And though it's not a major detriment to the game as a whole, it's the little touches that a visually evoked auditory response can't generate that leave me at a slight loss when this game has been presented so beautifully detailed. I'm off on a sad tangent again, but again, it's just the little things. I thought that the soundtrack and the dialogue for this game was amazing. The lead composer, Yoko Shimomura, did a fantastic job in conveying the emotion through the songs, just like Nobuo Uematsu did in previous Final Fantasy titles. In a Q&A session, she alludes to the fact that she still respects the work that Uematsu had put into shaping the series with his music, with the premise that emotion still plays a large role in the music. And I have to say, the contrast of the main title of 15 to arriving at the Hammerhead service station and then riding on a chocobo really plays into this world. The voice acting by the English cast was really good too, of course, my favourite being Darren DePaul's work on Arden on bringing that character to life. But the entire cast really did a good job on the voice work and just how they're able to convey emotions.
Oh, please help me out.
So, the moment you've all been waiting for. Is this game worth a buy?
Oh, definitely a buy.
As I mentioned before, this is one of the fewer games that actually had me invested in it from start to finish. Sure, it's definitely not the strongest game, and yes, you can argue that it's a cash grab with all the multimedia and DLCs that are available, but as far as an entire multimedia project based around the one game and having everything tying together in an engaging format is one of the more effective strategies that I've seen, and maybe you guys know of other games that have done this well too. Despite rumour mills saying that this could be possibly the last in the series, and with the amount of people bowing out from the project, it's becoming more of a possibility. But I think that this universe will most likely keep expanding for a while yet. In a sad sense, they would probably want to milk as much out of it as they can before bringing this to a close. And after 32 years of hanging on to the Final Fantasy series, when the first one came out on Nintendo, it might be a good time to wrap it up. Or if they do another one, I'd probably give my left nut to voice a character with my beautiful nasally voice. Anyhow, that about wraps up my review on Final Fantasy 15. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you for all of you who checked out my channel last year and subscribed. It's humbling to think people want to engage with my videos, and even though it's not a lot, it's just really cool to see. As always, like the video if you enjoyed, check out my lore video if you want more context on the Final Fantasy 15 universe, and subscribe for more that's coming up soon. I'd like to try and push myself harder this year and try out some more interesting things, so I hope you guys will stick around and support the madness. And I'll see you in the next video. This is Chris Bow signing out.